You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and today we're going to go back to the very origins of the Hollywood film industry as we look at the films of a woman often described as one of America's very first auteurs, Lois Weber, a unique case in the 1910s as she would write, direct, produce, and often even star in her own films. She's credited with popularizing the split-screen technique, most notably with Suspense from 1913, as well as featuring the first non-pornographic use of female nudity in her film Hypocrites from 1915, in terms of first nudity on screen, at least in the US. A film which, by the way, was Universal Studios' biggest financial success of that year. Additionally, she holds a few other records, such as being the first American woman to direct a feature film of her own, as well as the first American woman to own her own film studio. Oh, and she's also remembered for frequently clashing with the censors, with some of her films being banned in states, and some even causing literal riots. Today, she's perhaps best remembered for her social justice films, highlighting matters from poverty to contraception, though some of the morality at display may not fully translate as well 100 years later. We're probably going to get into that a bit in this episode as well, because it won't just be a puff piece. When Brett first started pushing for us to do this episode, it was not because he was an ardent fan, though he's quite a fan of Suspense. It was because he said that almost every film he watched of hers after Suspense just kept letting him down. He could not understand how she had essentially forgotten all of the great cinematic techniques she was pushing in that film. Luckily, we also have some counterbalance here, as we have invited on, for the very first time, Allison who has long had a particular interest for Weber and women pioneers in cinema. Meanwhile, I myself will be a bit more neutral, though I will tease that there is one Weber film I like more than Suspense, and that film happens to be Brett's least favorite of hers. So this should be really, really fun. I don't want to give Brett the very first word here, though. I also like to introduce our new guests first. So let's give Allison a big welcome to the podcast. I'd just love to hear a bit about your experiences with Weber and why it is that she holds a bit of a special place for you.
So my interest was in women pioneer filmmakers. I read a bit about Elise Blanchet, and that's where I first heard about Lois Weber, because back in the day, Elise Blanchet and her husband directed films at the studio in Fort Lee, New Jersey. And that's how they met Lois Weber. Lois Weber initially started as a singer, and she recorded some songs for their films. And even though it was silent, they still recorded some songs, which was really strange because in 1927, the jazz singer came out and was known as the first talking picture. But there was this thing called the chronophone, and Lois Weber recorded several songs on the chronophone, and Elise Blanchet was really obsessed with recording sound, like in 1906, I think it was. So Lois Weber kind of looked at Elise Blanchet and was like, oh, wow, I can do this. She said that they were little films, and she thought it was not difficult. I guess that was in regard to directing. Fast forward to a few years later, and she was ready to direct. I was pretty impressed by Suspense because every time a filmmaker does something, the publicists want to say, oh, they were the first to do whatever. And when Andy Warhol did Chelsea Girls, a lot of people said he was the first to do split screen. And we know from watching Abel Gance's Napoleon, that's not true. And predating that was Lois Weber's Suspense. I'm not sure if it was the first split screen film. It was like a triptych because there were actually 3 split screens shaped in a triangle, which is so, on one hand, bizarre and unique, and just watching it from, I think it was 1913, is just so impressive. So I'm mainly impressed by Suspense, but she brought up like women's rights, and she was really conservative at first, but then she kind of expanded her films to include like women's rights, and she did Shakespeare adaptations, and she was producing like a film a week at one point for several years. So she has hundreds of films. A lot of them are lost. So even whatever IMDb states, like she directed so much more than that. It says about 140, but she directed way more. Unfortunately, not all of those films survive. And I've watched like several fragments of her films too. So even some of the films that do exist, we don't see a full picture.
Yeah, it's pretty insane. I mean, I think that just based on IMDb, it's well over 100 films that she directed, and if that doesn't even include a lot of films, it's just absolutely insane. Obviously, the production wheels were running very fast in the 1910s, in particular in the early 20s. But it's hard to imagine just going through that many films, and some of them obviously also standing out and becoming classics that are either frequently seen or revered for being the first for XYZ item. And yeah, I mean, in terms of Suspense, I don't think I personally seen any split screen news search earlier. I mean, I looked it up and I see that there are some examples from 10 years before that as well.
Oh.
I think now there's one called Life of an American Fireman, which I've never seen, which apparently has like one split screen in it. But still, like, this is the big moment, I think, for split screens. Like, no matter where you go, like, there's always something first. People credit Godard when it's for, like, the jump cuts. He took it from John Rauch. And, like, we have jump cuts back in, the early 1900s as well. Jump cuts in the early 1900s as well. So there's always someone who kind of got there first, no matter what you do, right? But
Exactly.
But I think it's expensive. Also, the way it does it, it's amazing. But I think that's the film that I think now can really be seen as, okay, this is the first notable big film in a way. It's a short, but notable film that really introduced it. And we're already well into the suspense. So this might be a very good time to let Brett speak as well, as this is the film he loves the most. What is it that you admire so much about Suspense, Brett?
Sure. So Suspense was my introduction to Lois Weber. And I double-checked my notes and actually saw it within 1 month of joining the forum 11 years ago. So it was, I think, instrumental as well in my journey as a film lover. And I think what stood out for me when I first saw it was the use of split screen and just how different it was from any of the other films from that period that I'd seen up to that point, which admittedly was quite limited. But even afterwards, and after I saw more films or from that era or otherwise, it kept lingering in my mind and it kept rising in esteem in my own mind. So I actually revisited it just this week to see if it still held up or if I'd built up this myth about the film. And at first I was a bit disappointed that it wasn't quite as good as I remember, but then I started noticing more details that I either hadn't noticed the first time I watched it or had forgotten about, that beyond the iconic use of the triangle for that split screen in her storytelling, the other aspects of her camera usage, such as the camera looking down upon the tramp from an upstairs window, or focusing on the car behind the husband's car in the small rearview mirror or side view mirror. Things like that were may have been common in other films at that time that I haven't seen or have been lost, but felt very different from the very typical static, here's a room, you've got a matte backdrop, and we're filming this scene, and everyone just moves around in a single space in a single camera. It felt very dynamic and totally different from other things from that era that I'd seen. And it definitely helps to have a good soundtrack. And nowadays people are creating their own soundtracks and scores to silent films that we don't have the original music anymore. But I find that even without a soundtrack, this is a rare early film that still manages to hold my attention. I can watch it in complete silence and I'm still interested and invested with what's going on, which is very rare for me with other films from that period. And so I've been watching a number of her films this year for various reasons, and most of them were feature films. And every new feature film of hers that I saw, I kept thinking, this is the same director, Suspense? Where's all that innovation? Where's all that interest and pizzazz in these feature films? And I just felt like something was lacking. And so, as I mentioned to Chris, my hot take, so to speak, was that I was getting more and more convinced with each film that I saw from Lois Weber that Suspense was not only a near masterpiece, in my opinion, and far away her best film, but it was actually the only one worth watching. Now, having said that, I have watched more films from her in just the last few weeks, and I'm happy to say that's no longer my opinion. I do think there are more of her films worth watching, but I still don't think anything has come close to reaching the greatness of Suspense of the ones that I've seen.
Well, I'm glad you found more that you also talk about seeing. I'm going to be disagreeing with you a little bit on techniques and interest in filmmaking when we get to some of the later films. But just wanted to add that for me, Suspense might genuinely be the most suspenseful film I have seen made up until that point. I mean, it really, really lives up to its name. I also absolutely 100% agree with what you're talking about in terms of how exciting the camera work and filmmaking is here in general. Those shots you mentioned are just fantastic. It feels very dynamic. It has a great pace, and I think that car chase sequence, for instance, you mentioned seeing things in the mirror. There's, for instance, one portion of that car chase where you have a policeman trying to climb onto the car in front and jump from one car to another and shoot that through the rearview mirror while also showing the male protagonist's head being in clear distress. And that is just so exciting and dynamic, and I don't think I've ever seen anything as action-driven at this point in time. The way that the camera moves, it actually moves in some parts, if I recall correctly. Like, you feel it, like it's on the cars as well. I don't remember this being done in such a way ever before, and it's just, it really feels, obviously a lot of films from the 1900s are lost. There might have been something similar before, and there might be something that I've forgotten as well, but it's just, wow. I just don't remember feeling that rush before. I do think that it's not a perfect film. I think I like Suspense a bit less than you, Brett. In part, just like, for instance, that car chase, it's also kind of feels like it's played for laughs a couple of times. Like, there's this near accident happening. It could feel like, oh, this is something out of like a Buster Keaton or Harold Lloyd, just played a little bit more seriously, which I felt undermined attention a little bit. And it is like it's both a strength and a weakness that it's such a simple film. It's just a prowler is after a woman in a house and her husband is racing back. And that means that the overall storytelling is very limited in some ways. It could have been expanded, but the fact that it's so concise is also a strength in terms of just, it does exactly what it sets out to do. So I'm a little bit torn on that, but it's a really, really damn good film. And I would say it's probably one of the most important films to see from the early to mid 1910s.
One really interesting thing about Suspense, I was reading Anthony Slide's book. He has a book on Lois Weber called The Director Who Lost Her Way in History. And I guess for years, the film was credited to her husband, Philip Smalley. So eventually she got credit. But Philip Smalley would often assist her and receive undue credit just because he was around. And that happened a lot with women. They would sometimes give the credit to their boyfriends or husbands. But it's good to see like she's finally getting her due.
Yeah, and I noticed like credits on IMDb, for example, can be sometimes hard to modify. And there are a lot of films where sometimes the film's credited only to Lois. Sometimes it's credited to Lois and Phillips. Sometimes only to Phillips, which doesn't always reflect what was credited on screen. And in those early days, on-screen credits weren't necessarily as comprehensive as we're used to them being in modern days. And and with so much being left uncredited, sometimes it can be hard to figure out, well, who actually was it? And one thing I noticed when I was watching the films, especially the short films this past week, is that I started to get a better sense of what feels like a Lois Weber film in the choices that she's making and the storytelling that she's making. And there's actually one film we'll discuss later that it has a credit to Lois, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't directed by her. It was only written by her. And it feels to me different from the other shorts that I've seen from her, and just the way that the message is being portrayed on screen, which I found quite interesting because I don't often tune into those director traits. It's just not something that really pops out to me or that I pay attention to. So the fact that I actually was noticing it was something I found quite interesting. Discontent.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it did feel a little bit different. But yeah, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah. And one other thing about Suspense is I think by and large it's her most accessible film, mainly because it's a short, so it's easy for people to see. But I think because it is so dynamic, it's easier to get people to see nowadays, and it doesn't feel like, oh, it's just some stuffy old film. It's something that I think doesn't translate well, but it's more interesting to modern sensibilities, and I think it's survived opinion-wise because it is so different. And if you look at the films on iCheckMovies, it is number 3 in the top 100 from the 1910s. So of all the other films from that decade, it's still the 3rd most liked or favorite film of the users of that site. So, which I think is quite a high honor, personally.
Oh, definitely. If you're going to see any film by Lois Weber, definitely seek out Suspense. I mean, I'm going to pitch you to see Shoes at least too, but we get into that a little bit later. One thing I personally haven't done is sort out the films that Weber did before Suspense, but I think you guys have seen a few of them. Like, how would you say that the short films he did before Suspense compares?
Sure. I've seen a bunch, and most of them in the past week, actually, so they're relatively fresh on my mind. So I've seen 4 short films from her so far, from before or around Suspense. They are From Death to Life from 1911, Fine Feathers from 1912, The Rosary from 1913, and How Men Propose from 1913. And there's another one that Allison shared last night called The Twins from 1911, but I didn't get a chance to watch that before recording. All 4 of those films, they were okay. I didn't dislike them. I didn't particularly care for them. From Death to Life, it's an ancient drama with sort of dealing with alchemy. It's very standard with a matte backdrop and a single set. It was an okay plot, so nothing terrible, nothing really stood out for me, and it didn't feel like a Lois Weber film. Fine Feathers felt like a precursor to her later moral dramas. It's about a woman being taken in by a man because she's in a poor situation at her home, and then being taken advantage of, and a bit of romance thrown in. It was a bit more serviceable, but again, very static in its shot. A few techniques I was like, oh, that seems like a Lois Weber or Lois Weber trademark. And then The Rosary was the first one I saw from her that it was like, oh, this feels like Lois Weber. And it was the first one I noticed that it played around with the way that the film was shot. Most of the film takes place in almost a porthole that's surrounded by a rosary that's laid out on screen. So instead of taking up the entire screen, you only see the action taking place inside the rosary. And that playing with what you can see felt something that was more akin to Suspense than to the other films that we saw there. And that one, it's a Civil War romance drama, pretty standard fare, but just that technique alone made it feel like, oh, she's trying something different. She's testing things out. And then the last one from that era that I saw, How Men Propose, it's also shorter than the others. And it's just this silly little comedy that I was like, it's got a bit of a social message to it, but I just kind of felt it like, okay, that was, I've seen it, now I can forget about it.
What about you, Allison? Have you seen any of Lois Weber's films before Suspense?
Yeah, as Brett was talking about How Men Propose, this, or like my exact words, I said this short was very silly. And so, I mean, it's only one way to describe it. And Brett, did you notice in Fine Feathers, well, the version I saw had like a synchronized sound. There was actually like a man screaming. Did you notice that? Because it's very interesting in early silent films when there's actually synchronized sound.
I don't think the copy that I saw was synchronized.
Okay.
It was like a modern soundtrack that, because I noticed sometimes when people create a new score, they'll add things like a phone ringing or a scream to kind of mimic it, but I don't think it was the originals one.
Yeah, I think the version I saw had like traditional piano music, and it was credited to Liz Magnus. So maybe you saw a different version. So yeah, I would assume the man screaming was the original soundtrack, but maybe they added that. I'm not exactly sure. But also, when you were talking about From Death to Life, I know that there's like extreme damage to the reel. So it's really great sometimes when they have the actual footage, but a lot of the extant footage is actually damaged, and it's kind of hard to evaluate it per se. And then with the Rosary, it's been a while since I've seen it. My notes say it was like a circular screen view. So it's shot from inside the Rosary. Just like with that film and Suspense, just the way that it's shot, presenting it in a different, unique way is to make the actual subject matter more interesting.
Yeah, I felt that with Suspense. I didn't feel that with Rosary.
Oh, okay.
It was like, I noticed it, but it wasn't like, oh, this makes it more impactful. It was just like, it didn't feel gimmicky, but at the same time, it didn't feel like it was elevating the material. And I just double checked my notes, and I did see the same copy of Fine Feathers as you did, the one with the Liz Magnus score. And that score, if my notes are correct, was composed or commissioned in 2018 when the film went a restoration.
Oh yeah, cool.
And I think you're the only one of us who's seen The Twins, Allison. What did you think of that one?
That one was very interesting story-wise. It was kind of like long, but I think, because I just saw it yesterday, and it's like for years I've seen every Lois Weber film I could get my hands on, and I was just looking at YouTube yesterday. So the good news is on YouTube, and just the tinting and the story. The story is very interesting. Unfortunately, I think it was 1910, I was reading about her life. Lois Weber gave birth to a child. I think her name was Phoebe, and unfortunately, the child either was stillborn and died in infancy. So, cut to the very next year, she's making this film called The Twins, and it's about a child who dies. I don't want to give away too much, but it's very interesting and definitely drawn from her experiences. So, despite the fact that it's a little bit different, you could just definitely tell she's kind of using this as kind of a catharsis for her own child who died. But yeah, I just saw it yesterday. I didn't have time to really dig deep, but it's in the beginning. Are all these cute children. It's a very beautifully shot film, and it's worth checking out.
Fantastic. I will definitely get to it within the next few days then. And I think you said that one was either restored by or made available from the Eye Film Museum in the Netherlands?
Yes, their YouTube account. It's featured on their YouTube channel. So yes.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Yeah, lots of good recommendations from this. And it's also just nice that pretty much all of her films are now available in public domain on YouTube as well. So if anyone's out there is interested in going through Lois Weber's filmography, it's so easy to do these days. Obviously, most is sadly lost, but what is not appears to be largely readily available. And I think we can move on to the post-suspense films and actually dive into the features with one of the films I mentioned in my intro, Hypocrites from 1915, which could arguably be said to be one of the first art house films of all time as well, because it's leaning very heavily on metaphor, surrealism. It almost exclusively takes place in the dream of a priest who is fretting his parishioners' disdain for the truth after giving a sermon on hypocrisy, and his parishioners show up in his dreams in various ways, while he also seeks and also tries to bring truth to them. And truth here is in the form of a nude woman imposed onto the screen. So she's translucent. We have usage of double exposure, and there's a lot of really interesting techniques in terms of how the focus on her differs, especially in terms of foreshadowing events, looking deeper into characters' lives, and so forth. So in terms of technique, in terms of what we call like inspiration, there's so much to appreciate here, though for me personally it was not a film I could say that I enjoyed that much overall. It's decent, it's very interesting, but not quite for me. Where would you rank Hypocrites, Allison?
Oh, Hypocrites is definitely not one of my favorites either. However, based on the controversy around it, that's what makes it interesting. Ohio banned the film. We were talking about states banning films. This is one of them. And Boston audiences could only view the film after clothes were painted on. So I think Margaret Edwards was the quote unquote naked girl, and she won a gold medal for the most perfectly formed girl in the world at one point. That's just what my notes say. I don't know who awarded her that medal, but yeah, exactly. But Lois Weber was like, hey, let's feature her in the film. But I mean, can you imagine like a Boston theaters like, okay, we'll show the film, but only if clothes are painted on. Yeah. So
I think that's also really, really fitting in terms of what the films actually show, because there is this one scene where he goes to the priest goes to high society with Truth, and they say, "Oh, Truth can come in, but only if she wears our clothes." So it's gonna. Well, first of all, it's a nice double meaning with that, and secondly, Truth would have been clothed when in that scene.
Exactly. And it's really great that she made films for Universal earlier in her career. Then in 1914, she left Universal. And then this was the first film she made for Bosworth. Well, it says her first major film for Bosworth. So I don't know if I think it was her first film for Bosworth. But anyway, Hypocrites made Lois Weber a household name. So after this, she just kind of exploded into stardom. Because like a lot of women did direct during the silent period, but Lois Weber was actually very well known. And in 1911, women garnered the right to vote in California. And women got the right to vote in the United States in 1920. And so Weber was elected as the mayor of Universal City in 1913, which kind of astounded me. And then that's when I found out, like, oh, hey, California because like, how could she be elected mayor when women didn't have the right to vote? But they did in California in 1911. And so it was kind of cool. But unfortunately, when she left Universal, they also, like, she had to, like, she wasn't allowed to be mayor anymore. That's kind of weird but Universal City was like its own thing. But anyway, even when she left Universal, the fact that she became like a household name after that, when she left Universal, was kind of astounding. But she did a lot of work for Universal, but Hypocrites really propelled her and made her a household name.
I didn't know that about Universal and her being the mayor. That's interesting. It's like the definition of a company town.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
For me, I didn't like Hypocrites. I think a lot is made about double exposure, but that was being done, 10, 15 years earlier by Georges Méliès, left, right, and center. So it didn't feel like something new or innovative to me. The version that I saw is the 49-minute version, restoration that's available on Canopy. A lot of her films are available through that service. I think it's part of the collection of films that Flickr Alley released in restorations. And so it seems like there are two versions of the film that have been made available. that have the same footage, just maybe re-edited in slightly different ways. And when I was reading notes to figure out what version am I supposed to write, which one's the quote unquote correct version, it seems that even when it was released, it was being edited and re-edited for different audiences to see what they would watch and what they wouldn't watch. So it wasn't just about, the nudity and painting over some of that, but it was also completely changing the order of the scenes for whatever reason that I'm not quite sure of. So what I found is that it was an interesting idea. I believe she was inspired by a painting called The Truth, which featured a naked woman representing the truth, combined with something else that she was aware of, and she weaved it into this tale. It didn't hold for me. And I don't know how much of that is 1910 social mores compared to 2020 social mores, and that what we consider to be good or bad or scandalous these days isn't the same as what was considered back then. But I just found it a bit slow and plodding. It just didn't really appeal to me. And I remember there was, I think, the unveiling of the statue scene, and it's this, minute or two long panning shot of a crowd at almost like a fairground. And I had to read up about it to understand what was going on. And one article I was reading, I think it's the one I shared with you, Chris, was they were praising her for this use of this panning shot, and it was allowing all these people to be easily identified. And it's like, I don't know who any of these people are supposed to be, their social class, or sometimes it pans up to some symbol above them. To a modern audience, those symbols are meaningless. So maybe it meant something to audiences back then, but for me, it's lost in translation. And then it's showing this whole audience, and then it unveils the statue, and then it does another long pan of the reaction. And that sort of took me out of the moment, because if these people were having such a visceral reaction, they would all react immediately right away. They wouldn't wait for that camera to pan to them, focus on them first, and like, oh, now it's time to react. And it was like, it felt a bit gimmicky to me in that sense. It's like, look at this technique that we're using, which is very cool. But then it took me out of the story. And I'm sort of the opinion that all of the technical wonders and different tools you can use in making film should be there to support and push for the story. They shouldn't be taking away from it. And I know I'm not necessarily, this is not a unanimous thought amongst film viewers, but it's how I see it. And so for me, that technique, while impressive, took me out of what was happening in the story. It didn't make me feel like what I was seeing was flowing properly. And then there were other scenes I just felt dragged, like the climbing of the mountain, which also didn't make sense to me. And this sort of sets my interpretation of the way that Lois Weber made her films, is that it's very moralistic, and she imposes her perspective of the characters on the viewers instead of letting the viewers come to their own conclusion. At least in her earlier features, from my opinion. And I just felt like some of the ways that she was presenting it didn't line up with how I was seeing things. It was kind of a disagreeing taste in my mouth for it. But I do recognize that there were some interesting uses of technique to put the film, like when the modern day characters are played by the same actors as the dream characters, the way that they're introduced and the fading in and out of the two images superimposed, that was pretty cool. And I read that the scenes with the truth being filmed, they were shot in a closed set with just the actress, the director, and the cameraman. So it was, I guess even back then, it seemed like titillating to have a naked person on set. And I think the woman was quite young. I read that she met Lois Weber when she was 17. I'm pretty sure she was 18 at least when they filmed, or at least I hope she was. But it seems like even back then, there had to be some precautions taken to make sure that things weren't just for scandal or for people's amusement, but that it seemed very clear to me that Lois wanted to make sure that her film was taken seriously. And that is something as well that I can appreciate, even if I don't appreciate the film.
The things I appreciate most about the films are the things that you highlighted there, Brett, in terms of all of the techniques that are being used. There's so many variations of double exposures and transition and techniques. It's like like the Americans say, a smorgasbord of techniques blasted in one. It's just amazing to see that kind of almost cinematic bravery at this point in time. A lot of people were catching up to this stuff still in the 60s in terms of how to essentially be creative in this way. I think that you did hit the nail on the head there, though, that the big issue with this film very much leans on the morality itself and kind of the I guess what you said with Weber kind of just having her view rather than showing us, it's kind of just like she thinks it's self-evident, and that self-evidence probably decreasing decade after decade since the films came out. So we had this little talk yesterday, you and me, Brett, as well, where I was essentially asking, like, I don't see the hypocrisy in most of these things that are being shown. It felt a little bit like, when Griffith did Intolerance, and like half of the situations that he showed in that film that he called intolerant weren't really intolerant. There was something else that, could be bad. And here it's like people being lazy to see the truth is hypocrisy somehow. Like hypocrisy, it implies, that they hold one view and then they go against it in some ways. But we don't really see these characters say, okay, I want to know the truth. I want the clearest truth. I want to have the most difficult path, etc., and then failing. I mean, you have a scene, for instance, where this woman really, really tries to climb this really difficult path, but it's too difficult for her in the metaphors. And I'm not sure if this is meant to be seen as hypocrisy, that she fails after a lot of trials and asking for help. There's also these sequences towards the end where things are shown one way and then the truth is revealed, and the truths don't. Again, like we talked a bit, and Brett gave some good interpretation of why it could be seen as hypocritical, but it's like one scene where a man is wooing a woman and we see their future, and he plays cards, gets into a fight, and he dies. And like, I don't like between possessing his love and gambling. Like, gambling might be a deed that's not seen well by Christianity, but I don't know why that's hypocritical in terms of wooing the woman, for instance. Similarly, there's a scene where a family is grieving a potentially dying infant, and you have a flashback to where there's a metaphors around like a book that has sex written on it, and another child reads that book and it's like, oh no, the family is like has some flaws in it, essentially, or they have they're allowing their children to be exposed to this stuff. But I don't see what that has to do with their youngest child potentially dying. So there's definitely a bit of a disconnect in the moral views and values of 110 years ago and what we would read into it today. Anyways, with that, we might also want to just go on to the next film, which is one I have not seen, which is a short film, Discontent, from 1916, which I believe both of you saw over the last couple of days. So what are your thoughts on Discontent, and how would you say it stands up against your other films from this period?
Brett, do you want to go first? I know you were saying it felt different than her other films, and that's a fair point. I think she had a co-director listed on IMDb. It said it was co-directed by Alan G. Siegler, which I'm not really sure what the story is behind that. I remember when I first saw it, I was very amused. It seems to be way funnier than her other films. And I saw it a couple of times yesterday. Okay, so the plot is an aging veteran, tired of his life in the veterans home, decides to move in with his wealthy uncle. I think it was his actually nephew. Okay, the IMDb is wrong. Okay, so anyway, it's basically a grass is always greener on the other side, because by the end, the aging veteran decides he's had enough of his nephew's way of living. When he's at the veterans home, he wants to be with his nephew. When he's with his nephew, he basically sneaks back into the veterans home, tail between his legs, and it's just kind of funny. The expressions of the elder man, the actor is J. Edwin Brown, which I'm not really familiar with outside of this film, but it just seemed a little bit more humorous than her other films. So perhaps that was the influence of this Alan J. Siegler director. So any other thoughts, Brett?
Yeah, the opening credits, it says that the story was written by Lois and then it was directed by Alan. And then when I was doing a bit more research, there's another comprehensive website that lists all of Lois Weber's credits, and it said that she's only the screenwriter on this. And that kind of holds up for me in how I saw the film. It didn't feel like her other shorts. I could see a little bit of the morality touches in it in the script, but the way that it was shot and the fact that, like you mentioned, it's much more humorous made it feel like it was made by another director. That aside, I thought it was an okay film. I think it was the only thing I kind of disagree with the film about is one of the reasons why the veteran decides to go back to the old folks home is he's causing so much discontent amongst the entire household. And it was like, oh, he's influenced the wife to think of this and influenced the son to think of that and the daughter to think of that. And it's how he's leading them astray kind of thing. And one thing of leading them astray is that with the son who wants to become a minister or a priest, someone in the clergy, he says to him, how can you go preach to people if you don't know their troubles? Which I thought to be rather insightful for that time. But then the son gets in trouble because he's being caught frequenting dance halls and his father chastises us for him. And the film sort of sets up like, oh no, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't be compassionate towards people in poor situations, which I found a bit strange. But another thing that I did find interesting was I think it's one of the earlier films to sort of discuss veterans. And I guess at this point in cinema, these are probably veterans of, if not the Civil War, maybe, the American Spanish War or American Cuban War in the late 1890s. And just looking at the conditions of veterans, you see scenes where, it's almost like they're in a hospital wing where they just got cots lined up against the wall. So I know it's not necessarily the intention or the main focus of the film, but I thought it was an interesting window into how veterans were depicted or treated over 100 years ago. And this would have been before the U.S. entered World War I. So, which is now like World War I and World War II of what we now think of as veterans, or maybe I guess now for us is like the Korean War, Vietnam War, or even the wars in the Middle East. But just looking at how perceptions of veterans back then were compared to how things are today, I thought that was a thing of minor interest for me as well.
Yeah, that does actually sound interesting, even though sort of the morality it's kind of slightly off again. And yeah, you're absolutely right, but this is one of the things that's really interesting when you go back like over 100 years ago as well and you see a similar situation, because like you're right, this could easily even be the American Civil War, which ended about 50 years before this film came out. So like if this, depending on the age of this veteran, it's even possible. So yeah, very, very interesting. I think we can move on to the next film on our list then, which is one I saw just yesterday, The Dumb Girl of Portici, which follows a vanilla poor Italian girl who is mute and falls in love with a Spanish nobleman, essentially in the midst of a revolution per se, or the revolution kind of sparks from some of the things that she is involved with and her brother is involved with. There's a lot of overall dramas here, interpersonal drama, love affair, family dramas, political under and overtones, and it's essentially an historical epic. I was personally very impressed by the scale of this film. It's the longest film I've seen from her. I think it's her longest film that survives. It's almost 2 hours, which, I mean, obviously, we know D.V. Griffiths was making longer films at this point, but having films at approximately this length in the mid-10s was still not the most common thing, and it's a proper epic. It also feels really of scale. While I didn't absolutely love all elements of it, I think it's just a good film overall. Like what Weber and Smalley really succeeded on here was the spectacle. Everything feels large. There's huge violent clashes. You can feel the violence. In some cases you can feel the flames. There's some really nice tinted scenes here as well, where we go all red as the flames consume us. I think that's just really well done. And like, I think one of the thoughts I had while watching it was that it felt a little bit like, for instance, when Ernst Lubitsch was doing his historical dramas and mini epics like 4 or 5 years later, and cinema came a long way in those 10 years. And I would say that what Weber and Smalley did here compares in terms of cinema techniques and scale. So very impressed overall. I think that this is one of I think her only film that I have seen, which would kind of place in the sense of spectacle in a similar light as Griffith as well, in terms of just being quite far advanced in ahead in terms of just this kind of epic. What did you guys think of The Dumb Girl of Portici?
So I watched the film 2 nights ago, and after finishing it up to that point, it was the best Weber film that I'd seen. And I jokingly thought to myself, well, I wonder if it's because she didn't write it. In the sense that she did write the script, but it's not based on an original idea. So it's a combination of the opera, The Dumb Girl of Portici, which is based on real life events that took place in Italy that are somewhat similar to what's portrayed in the film. She's definitely taken a lot of poetic license, not just from the opera, but also from the real event itself. And then combined with the story of the mute sister from another author. She took that character and the character's name even, if Walter Scott, or I forget who it was, from a book that he wrote. So she kind of made her own film combining those two elements. I felt the film dragged at some parts, and other parts it was quite exhilarating. And I read that it was billed as, America's first blockbuster, whether that was at that time or a retroactive title applied to it, which does make sense. Like, it was pretty expansive cast, a bigger set, and it was a star vehicle essentially for the ballerina Anna Pavlova, who was quite the sensation at the time. And I think this is the only film or only feature film that survives with her in it. And ironically, she doesn't do much dancing in the film. There are some really interesting dance scenes, though, but not featuring her. So I quite enjoyed it. I could sort of see the Lois Weber touches on it and how she shifted the story or crafted the story. But I found it very different from the other films. It's not really a morality tale in the same sense as some of the other films we're going to discuss later, even though there are some moral aspects of it. But there's also a lot of moral ambiguity, and I think that's something that she doesn't touch upon as much as I would like, but it's got some impressive set pieces. I think the battle scene was quite exciting and exhilarating. It was easier for me to follow along with what was happening, even though I wasn't familiar with the opera or the history, in the way that she had framed the narration without the use of too much intertitles. And I thought it was pretty good. Definitely one of the better films from the era for me, at least.
What did you think, Allison?
Okay, I'm going to have to agree with Brad that the set pieces were great. And so in 1916, Carl Laemmle selected Lois Weber to direct Anna Pavlova. It was actually her screen debut, and it's interesting to hear that not any other footage survives.
There's one other short film that survives where she's featured, but I think it's just her dancing. It's not her actually acting in a feature role, if I'm not mistaken.
But it's very interesting that this was definitely her screen debut. So, and yeah, I like the sets. I mean, Anna Pavlova was featured like in a white dress against the black backdrop. That was very dramatic. But yeah, the story did drag a lot for me. I was very excited to see it when I did see it, but it just kind of dragged. So, but I mean, it was epic, but didn't always keep my interest.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It definitely has severe pacing issues. While there is that more ambiguity and the characters have some complexity to them, at least it's just where it really succeeds is the spectacle. I think most of the character drama is not managing to be as exciting as it could have been. There are some interesting dancing there, though. I would say that Pavlova does, like especially the beginning. There's these dances and the ending. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but it's about a 2 or 3 minute sequence there, which is really breathtaking. I thought it elevated the film quite a bit in just terms of how it was shot. There's some double exposure there. That was just a really, really, really nice touch. So that really got an extra point for me. And the way that was shot, in some ways, feels similar to the next movie we're going to talk about, which is Where Are My Children, also from 1916. And but by the way, this was Universal's most successful release in 1916 as well. It was another one of those films that caused a lot of ruckus at the time of release. It's another one of those films that was banned. I consider it was at least banned in Pennsylvania. They tried to get it banned in New York even as well. So a lot of furore. It's a really, like, this is a really interesting film by today's standards, because it is essentially a pro-contraceptive film that is also anti-abortion. There's a lot of touches that are similar to Hypocrites in terms of these really fantastical scenes from heaven, where you have the souls of unborn babies waiting to come to life. There's, again, a lot of interesting double exposure happening throughout the film, and the plotting overall is quite interesting too. I don't think it's as judgmental as some of those other films, because essentially you have a story of a prosecutor and his wife, and he wants children, but his wife doesn't, and she frequently has secret abortions, which kind of comes to a head when the abortionist doctor is arrested for the death of a woman, and it kind of starts to spiral into their life. And it sounds like a really exciting film in a lot of ways. I think it was played a bit, like, it didn't captivate me as much. I think that, the drama could have been played up a bit more. We could have gotten, it is a little bit shallow, if you will, in terms of characterizations. You have to still have, like, it's a moral tale in many ways. But I did like that it did not aggressively judge the women having abortions as well. I thought that was an interesting touch. It doesn't hit as strongly against them as you would expect a film at this point to do, especially having an anti-abortion message. So it's a little bit more even on that. But yeah, I would say that it's a film that has some really, really interesting and exciting visuals. But overall, it's not a film I enjoyed that much. How would your opinions compare to mine?
I thought it was stronger films, and I saw it a long time ago, so my views were a little bit different. It mainly supports birth control as opposed to abortion. And so, especially as controversial for modern day feminists, they don't really feel like she, let's see, it says, think in a book, it said feminists have found it difficult to completely embrace Weber as a pioneering director because of her views. You're correct. It's not that judgmental. Well, in a way, but it's sort of, well, it definitely does speak out against abortion, and it tries to provide other means like birth control. So National Board of Review passed the film as long as it was shown to only adults. And I think you were right. The Philadelphia Board of Censors also banned it. So let's see. Oh, it also grossed $3 million. So it was very popular. But yeah, it kind of does have an outdated way. Like, it shows a woman who's seen smoking and drinking and arranging a party. So I don't know. So basically, the woman goes to the abortion doctor too many times. And then the quote is, she's had abortion so many times, now she can't have children. And I'm sure back in the day it was way more difficult to get an abortion since it was illegal, and sometimes, yes, it prevented women from having children. Although today it's mainly a safe procedure. Although, oh my God, since abortion rights have been rescinded in several states, like, it can be dangerous now. So by reversing Roe versus Wade, a lot of women, especially in Texas, if you do a quick Google search, they died in parking lots because they've encountered sepsis, and the doctors won't touch them and leave them to die in parking lots. So all the old abortion movies from back in the day, unfortunately, before abortion was legalized, they're becoming more and more pertinent these days. And it's really sad because women progressed so much. We retained so many rights, and now in the United States, at least, it's several steps back. So I'm not really sure. Well, but anyway, I think Lois Weber's stance, since she was very conservative, was that birth control is better than abortion.
Yeah, for me, I wasn't a big fan of this film either. And this one and the next film we're going to discuss kind of cemented my idea of Lois Weber as this sort of morality tale, conservative filmmaker that I didn't really enjoy. I felt it very heavy-handed, actually. And I also saw this a number of years ago, so it's not as fresh in my memory. And maybe it merits a rewatch, but I didn't feel like it was a balanced tale. It felt very judgmental of the characters, especially like the way that so like the whole premise of the film, where are my children? It's like, it's a man's right to have children and the woman has to deliver them, provide them for him. It just really rubbed me the wrong way. And this, and with a couple of films as well from her, it makes me think of, is this an accurate portrayal of what society thought at that time? Is this just her personal opinion or the opinion of the filmmakers? And it makes me think of, in modern times, in the past, say, 20 years, there have been a number of Christian films which very much they're made by Christian companies that sort of lean under modern politics, like lean to the right, more conservative and very quote unquote traditional films. And it's almost as if the films of Lois Weber are some of the few films that did survive from the 1910s, or I guess the morality films of Lois Weber, I should say. If something similar happened now where most of the films from the 21st century were lost, but the majority of the ones that did survive were these Christian films, would future historians think that this is an accurate reflection of modern morals, sensibilities, and stuff like that? So I just find it interesting in that aspect. And maybe it's not a perfect analogy, but it's something that sprung to mind for me. But I just couldn't get on board with the point of view of the storytelling, which made it very hard for me to appreciate any other aspects of the film. And it's not one of my favorite. Maybe I need to revisit based on the information that you said, Chris, and in your comments too, Allison, about how she started out as more conservative and then became more liberal over time. And I was reading that there's another film that unfortunately does not survive from 1917 that was also made on the subject of birth control, called The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, which was made in support of legalizing birth control, which for me seems very strange, made right after this film, because I didn't see, or maybe I didn't pick up on the pro-birth control messaging of Where Are My Children? So it's, from a historical viewpoint, it's very interesting to be able to see the portrayal of contemporary social ideas put into film, even if I don't necessarily share those same ideals nowadays.
Yeah, interesting that you said that, Brett. I mean, there was this one court scene, and I think the film tries to be balanced on birth control as well. There is this one court scene early in the film where it shows specific texts from a book that is on trial, essentially, that's pro-birth control. And you essentially have several of these short passages that all of the audience can read, which are kind of like just focusing on them and leaves them there, which are all of these little mini cases for why unwanted children shouldn't come into the world. Which then, is a bit of an interesting thing that, it then goes on to abortion and kind of shows abortion as wrong in the same light, because there will also be unwanted children not being born. But of course, I think the film very clearly takes the view that life begins at conception. And just one point too, in terms of the Where Are My Children title, towards the end, that also echoes for the woman, as she changes her mind, she wants children, she can't have them, and then the whole film kind of goes into, like, for the rest of her life she'll wonder, like, where are my children? And essentially you have her aborted children popping up throughout her life as these, like, ghostly figures. Oh, and one fun trivia, since that got quite dark, one of those ghost children is actually the child of the two leads. So interestingly, this is Tyrone Power Sr., who plays the attorney, and his wife, Helen Romy. They are the on-screen main couple, and their son, Tyrone Power, the American actor, this is actually, he's not credited, but this was his first on-screen role. Essentially, that's this ghost child popping up for a few seconds. So that's that's a nice little mini anecdote from that. But moving on to the next film we talk about, my personal favorite of the Lois Weber films, and Brett's least favorite, Shoes. And contrary to the previous films that we've been talking about, I actually thought that Shoes holds up fairly well to contemporary morals. So essentially, just very quickly summarized, it's about a young woman who's the only person in her family that works. Like on just a few dollars a week, she supports both her parents and her younger siblings, but her shoes are wearing out. Like there's holes everywhere. She just her bare feet that are essentially walking. She tries to stuff them with cardboard cutouts. It's not working, and she's just dreaming about buying new shoes. But because they're so poor, because all of her money goes into the household, she can just never get new shoes, no matter how much worse they get. And she becomes more and more desperate, to the point that she even considers, as the original title card set up, that she even considers sex work, essentially sleeping with this man who has an eye on her for money. And I felt that the film did that without judging her for it. I felt that it had a very clear view on poverty and highlighting poverty and how it can push people to do certain things. And unlike all of her previous films, I don't feel like there was a lingering sense of judgment. I felt like the main character was portrayed with a great sense of empathy throughout. And I was also really, really impressed by a lot of the techniques and camera work here. This is a very alive film. Like if you compare this to Dumb Girl of Patrizia, for instance, it's shot in a very different way. Like obviously this is more about an hour long, it's a far more personal film, it's a drama, it's not as large of a scale, but like you have this girl who's working in this shop, you have people, the way people moving in and out of the frame, the camera moves sometimes, they even have this really amazing tracking shot of her shoes as she walks through a rainy street. It's only a few seconds long, but the camera follows her feet as she walks. And again, these are little touches that you never really saw in cinema at that point. I mean, that specific shot almost reminded me of something like Out of Wings from 13 years later. So I was really, really impressed by pretty much everything going into this film. Yes, it's a bit of a melodrama. Yes, that it might be some complaints about the pacing here too, but overall, I was very, very, very impressed by Shoes, and I would say it's a genuinely great film.
I hated this film. To be fair, I look back through my notes and what I'd written about this before, and this was actually the first feature-length film from the 1910s that I ever saw 10 years ago. And it's only about an hour long, but it still felt long for me. And I think perhaps I do need to revisit this one because I think I have a better understanding of setting expectations for films from that period and what to expect and the limitations of technology at that time. But what was the worst part for me was just the heavy-handedness of this being a morality tale. And I don't think I was able to appreciate any of the technical marvels that you were discussing, Chris, though I did make note of, I said, my notes were, the most interesting part was when the colors changed from green to blue for a moment, which shows, I guess, my frame of mind when watching the film back then. But yeah, it's just so heavy-handed. It took all the enjoyment out of me. I don't feel like it was sympathetic to the main character at all. It's almost kind of like what we would call slut-shaming nowadays. I feel like the film doesn't side with its lead. And for me, it portrays her in such negative light. Whereas from my perspective, when I was watching it, like, I'm on this girl's side 100%, regardless of if the filmmaker wants me to be on her side or not. And I just didn't like how the film was treating its lead, whether by intention or by my own interpretation. And that alone made it very difficult for me to appreciate anything else in the film. And I saw this only a year after I saw Suspense, and it felt like a very different filmmaker was making this film that was making Suspense. Though now I see more of the connections between them. And it's not something I enjoyed, and it really put me off from wanting to explore anything more of her filmography for a number of years. And actually I saw Where Are My Children a few years later, and that was back in 2017, and I didn't see any other films of her until this year. So it was 8 years. I was just like, nope, I'm done with this filmmaker. I don't want anything to do with her until I decide to start exploring more of her work this year. So that 1-2 punch from 1916 just really didn't do it for me. Though I am glad now that I've given her a second chance.
Yeah, happy you're going to give her a second chance. I'm glad I gave Shoes a chance despite your negative review. I do disagree with you about how the protagonist is portrayed. I mean, there's these long sequences, for instance, of her just fixing her shoes. I personally felt that the film was entirely sympathetic with her, but that could be that I, like you, Brett, like we were just fully on her side and misreading the intention of the filmmaker as well. I'll be perfectly open to that. Maybe I misread it, but I thought it was very heavily on her side throughout. I think the only thing that was a bit semi-jarring in terms of just I guess difference between time ages is that you have like the portrait of the father as this really lazy character, which tracks. He's clearly a lazy character, but the way he's portrayed as lazy is that he's reading a book. Now, obviously, today reading a book is a very different connotation than then. I mean, essentially, like today would probably be a character who's just on his phone and watching football. In the 90s would be someone who's watching TV, but here you have someone who's consistently reading and things like that. That's the height of laziness, essentially. I thought that was the interesting kind of different way of portraying something and how times change. But no, I just thought that it was I thought the film was on her side. I felt like it was very humanist portrayal of her, and I think the final intertitle title screen says as well, and life goes on regardless, kind of thing. Like even no matter what happened, life goes on. It just settles on the family life, and things continue. So I felt that it was very humanist, but maybe it's not. So that would be a good thing to open up for the forum as well. And we'll ask everyone when we put up the official thread, like, do you think the film was on our lead side or not? Let us know. And with that, I think we can jump on actually 5 years into the future and go to the early 1920s, a very different period of American cinema, and go to two wise wives. And that's not two, by the way, as in it's not a number two, it's TOO, wise wives. So it is actually about two wives. So I guess maybe it's a play on words as well. I thought this was a very well-made film as well. I think in terms of shots and editing, etc., it feels very much of a film like of the highest caliber of this early 20s era. Again, it kind of felt like, I'm not sure, like, I keep thinking about Ernst Lubitsch in a lot of these cases with his dramas, because like when he did dramas rather than comedies, they often felt a bit stale, and that's kind of the sense I have here too. It feels like a bit more of a stale film, even though it's very technically competent. I wasn't overly swayed by the plots, though interestingly, I was expecting more of a morality tale, and there are obviously elements of morality here, but it's not like a full-blown morality tale as everything else. This is essentially about a scheming wife trying to steal a man from another woman. I think it could have gone in some different directions than it did, but it's a perfectly decent film, and I'm happy I caught it. Well, what did you guys think about it?
I found it was serviceable. And one thing to note, I would say, is since her 1916 films, Lois Weber actually had her own production company, Lois Weber Productions, and this is one of the films that they made, which was, I guess, afforded her more control even more than she had before. With Two Wise Wives, it was fine. It was less preachy than the other films, I felt, but it didn't leave that much of an impression on me, I would say. If you're going to start with to explore Lois Weber's films, I don't know if I would start with this one, but it might be one of the more accessible simply because it doesn't really have much to say.
Ouch! I see that Allison's writing in chat that she doesn't have too much to say about Two Wise Wives. Either is one of her least favorites as well. For me, it's like middle of the road. It didn't have, like you said, Brett, it doesn't have those kind of off-putting elements that some of her more heavy-handed films did. But at the same time, it's It's fairly forgettable work. We can skip on to the other fairly big film she did in 1921, then The Blot, which is, in my opinion, one of her better films. I didn't rewatch it ahead of this episode. It's also more of a morality play-ish. You could call it a bit of a social justice film as well, specifically around poverty. Once again, looking into its effects on a family and just the issues of living with it, but it also kind of turns into a romance film as well. There's different kinds of subplots. Again, fairly well made, very competent. And I thought overall the plotting was much more engaging than Two Wise Wives. What did you guys think about it?
So I watched The Blot last night, actually, and it's my favorite Weber feature film. It's taken the number one spot, though it still doesn't hold a candle to Suspense for me. I actually quite enjoyed it. It also didn't feel quite as heavy-handed, or at least as one-sided of a morality tale as some of her other features do for me. I was impressed in the fact that it's got a fairly large cast, and I thought that the film did a good job of keeping them all distinct. Oftentimes I find in some of these earlier films is I have trouble distinguishing all the characters, remembering who's who and what. But in this, there are two families and another handful of characters. And yet I could remember who each and every one of them were. They were visually distinctive, but also their characterizations were distinctive. And I thought that was a pretty impressive thing to pull off. And it's a bit more of a standard tale, but I still saw where she was able to incorporate what I think of as some of her trademark cinematography, shots through windows and something taking place in the background that you're focusing on while there's something happening in the foreground. And I felt like this film gave her characters room to breathe. And it didn't feel like you were preordained to have an opinion about each of the characters. You were allowed to form your own opinions of them. The two mothers in the film, I think, start off being very negatively portrayed, despite being sort of at opposite ends of the spectrum or scale, which I thought was interesting because you're not told whose side to pick. It's a poverty tale. This one's also got a scene about, stuffing the shoes with cardboard to make them last longer, and I just found it more well done than it done in Shoes. Maybe it's because it's just one scene instead of an entire film made out of that concept. But it's got some lighter moments, some unexpected things, such as the friendship between the rich kid and the poor preacher. The main point of view, I think, that Weber was putting across was the poor treatment of academics and the clergy, which kind of surprised me. I wasn't fully sure if I bought into the premise that, a university professor wasn't making enough money to live. Like, for a modern audience, it seems, absurd, but maybe that actually was the reality back then. So it's an interesting insight into that. So if you can accept that basic premise as true, then I think it's really easy to get into the film and see where things go. If you have trouble accepting that basic premise, then I think you'll have trouble going ahead with the film. But I thought it gave chances for each of the characters, even some of the minor ones, to sort of have their moment. The girlfriend of the rich kid, she gets her own moment, and she's shown to be much less one-dimensional than you would expect to see in a film like that. And I felt the ending was a bit ambiguous, though in reading some information online, it seemed others felt that it was very definitive in how it ended in terms of which characters ended with which. There's a love quadrangle at the center of it, I guess, with three suitors for the woman. And I kind of liked the fact that it was ambiguous. You didn't really know how it was going to end, but I guess that's open to interpretation, which is a good sign for me in that it's not just here's the single narrative and this is how it goes and stuff, that it is a bit more open and free. And I quite like that aspect of it. So it's not a great film, but for me, it's the best of the ones I've seen so far from Lois Weber, and one of the better films from the silent period that I've seen and I can say that I've actually enjoyed.
So it seems that the plot was an outstanding critical success, but it didn't really make that much at the box office. And in 1982, Carrie Rickey wrote in the Village Voice that it was precocious. It was a social realist film, and she compared it to D.W. Griffith's True Heart Susie for what that's worth. But as for the film itself, I felt like it was just kind of okay.
Yeah, like I'm leaning slightly more towards good than okay, personally, but yes. It's one of the films by Weber that I liked a bit more, but at the same time, I had to look back at my notes from when I saw it a few years ago to properly remember it as well. One of the notes that I did make was that it felt in some ways that it was a film primarily about its message about teachers' pay, but then it kind of went off from that and decided to focus on that love quadrangle, which felt slightly odd, felt like it was distracting from its main message, like it was a commercial concern a little bit, but I didn't mind. I think it was perfectly serviceable, those elements, and I agree with you, Brett. It has a nice mix of like some cute romance elements, humor, some ambiguity, it's decent amount of nuance, and just as with most of her films, it has a decent fluidity to the shots. There's some good shots in there, etc. So I thought it was a very competent, good film, but not one that I would highlight as one of the best of the 20s or anything like that, which is a shame. It feels like Weber is just one of those directors who never really lived up to her potential, which kind of ties back to your point about Suspense as well. I think that if she had, become a thriller director, like she could have, beaten out the Hitchcock or something like that. Who the hell knows? But she could easily have leaned more into that, or lean more into the best or most exciting elements from Hypocrites or Where Are My Children as well. Become something closer to Murnau or Lang, for instance, who was doing these things over in Germany. But it feels like instead she took a much more conventional commercial path. It makes sense. It's the US. That's what the US wanted. It didn't have room for that in the 20s either. And she did also kind of start to disappear in the 20s. She ended up only making one sound film, which I haven't seen. Have you guys seen anything that she made after The Blot, by the way? Because I haven't.
No, this is the last film of hers chronologically that I've seen. I do have two more of hers that I found online that are available. A Chapter in Her Life from 1923 and The Sensation Seekers from 1927. So they're both available on YouTube, so I will catch them at some point, but they're both silent films. I don't know if her sound film is available or not.
I think I read that it lost, unfortunately. So the film she made was White Heat from 1934. I saw that it was shown on TV in the 1940s, but there's not really been any trace of it since. It has a rating on IMDb, though, but sometimes these lost films still have ratings.
Yes, I see. Sensation Seekers, critics at the time noted that it was like her reemergence as a film actor. That was from 1927. And then I also saw, I think she had a film, What Men Want.
That's from 1920 or 1921, but that one, it's incomplete. I think only 40 minutes remain out of what was a longer film. That's something else I was going to talk about here. Yeah, 1921. So it's from the same era as this. And it originally was 70 minutes long, but only 40 minutes have survived. So I actually didn't watch this one intentionally because I wanted to focus more on the films I had completed. But I wanted to bring this film up because it does seem to be one of the more popular ones. And I think it just highlights the fact that there is we covered a good span of her films here, but there's so much more that she made that unfortunately we're never going to get a chance to see just because it didn't survive. And as much as I may not appreciate her filmmaking, I think it's a shame that so much of her work was lost. And I don't know if I can ever properly have form a good opinion or a proper opinion of her because there's so much of her work that will remain unseen. And just to rebuttal against what you were saying there, Chris, about The Blot, I think the romance and telling a lot of the story through the perspective of the daughter was actually making the issue more accessible. Because I think if the film had just focused on, the poor professor and the poor priest, it can get very alienating quickly. It's almost like the daughter is a window into the world, and it's saying, okay, yeah, the professor's not paid. Well, oh, poor professor, but you don't really feel that sympathy. But when you see the consequences of the professor not being paid enough, in that they don't have enough money to feed the family, they could lose their house, that affects the daughter's health, even though she's working, and through the daughter's illness, that brings about this other change in this other character, and it affects, like, how all of these, 15 or so characters, they're all interwoven, and what happens to one character has impacts on how other characters' lives play out. I thought that was actually quite powerful, that you don't often see in a lot of films, is the interconnectedness and how the consequences for one person affect other people. And I thought that was a really smart way of pushing forward the message, because it didn't feel like a message film to me. It didn't feel like the constantly harping on, oh, we need to pay these people more. Like, it's very clear about that at the end and someone at the beginning, but I felt like it didn't feel like it didn't feel like I was being hit over the head with the same message over and over and over throughout the film. It felt like I was being told a story that had a purpose behind it, but it led me there gradually and allowed me to get on board at my own pace instead of telling me this is how I had to feel.
Really good point, Brett. You might actually be very right. Like, I haven't seen this film in years either, so if I watch it, I'll keep that in mind. And what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I'm very interested, by the way, Allison, because you said you've seen the Sensation Seekers, and that critics at the time was calling it like a return to form. What did you think about it? Is that a film that Brett and I should seek out?
Let's see. It was one of the ones that I saw relatively more recently, I think. Maybe not. Here, let's see. Oh, no. I saw it in 2013. It's decent. I gave it a 6 out of 10, which I'm a harsh critic. It just means to me that it's okay. So maybe not one of her best films, but definitely interesting.
All right, noted. We might get to that one eventually then too. We'll see if Brett actually does follow up and watch those films, given how he's said his feel about almost every single one of her other films too throughout the podcast.
I will. Maybe not this year, but I will. And if they're like her later films, then I'll probably think it'll just be okay as well, and that's fine with me.
Fair enough. I mean, I think one thing that will be very interesting is if there are any big Lois Weber fans on the forum to see if they can really challenge us and be annoyed that we didn't have any of them on this podcast. Again, let us know in the dedicated thread. There will be one up for it as soon as this episode is live. So if you're listening to this on Spotify, you can just find us on icmforum.com as well. And until then, thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.